Welcome back to another episode of Proof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. We are going to have a great conversation today about Rhodesia, all things Rhodesia, with a friend named Will Tanner, who's had some viral threads and is a student of history, a lawyer, and we get to talk about Rhodesia, so it'll be a great time. Before we get into that, I wanted to let you know about a great product I've been using called Ion Layer. Ion Layer patches are things that I'll use after a workout. I use them about once a week, and they're great for recovery after a workout. They're great for energy production. You slap those things on and you get an NAD treatment. An NAD treatment is something you typically would get intravenously. With an IV, you would have to go to a clinic, cost thousands of dollars, but Ion Layer has provided a patch that you can put on. These medical field patches that have been used for decades for people who don't like to get an IV treatment. These patches come straight to your home, and they come with NAD+. NAD+ is essential for mitochondrial function and energy production and recovery. And so I use them for that. I think you might be interested in it. They have a great opportunity for you to get $100 off your first kit if you go to ionlayer.com and use code FPT. FPT, that stands for Foolproof Theology. Use code FPT at ionlayer.com. Get $100 off your first kit. It's a great deal compared to those IV drips that you would have to get for NAD+ treatment. If your NAD levels decrease by about 50% by the time you're 50. And so these are a great way to keep up, keep active. Go to ionlayer.com, use code FPT, get $100 off your first kit. Let's get into today's episode with Will Tanner on Rhodesia. Today, we're going to talk about Rhodesia, all things Rhodesia. There's a lot of, on the right, curiosity about Rhodesia. And so I wanted to have a guest on that has kind of gone viral on a few posts. Will Tanner, he's the co-founder of the American Tribune. He's a member of the Presbyterian Church in America. Will, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's exciting.
So I wanted to first, before we get off on Rhodesia, I wanted to kind of hear more about your background, where you're from. Are you a historian? You help run the American Tribune. Tell me more about yourself.
Yeah, so I am originally from outside Atlanta, Georgia. Went up to Virginia for undergrad and liked it there. Majored in accounting and politics and got into, I've always been into history, but there I got more into writing about politics and that sort of thing through campus organizations. Just finished up law school, and a kind of digital media company I helped start towards the end of college, beginning of law school, has taken off. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that for work. And now that I'm done with the bar and everything, I'm excited to get going with it more and do more stuff like this.
That's great. What kind of law are you studying, or did you study and you're trying to get into?
I'm mainly focused in real estate law. I didn't want to work for a big firm, and most of the kind of local law shops aren't a great place to make a living. So that'll be more just for personal use and investing and that sort of thing, not for practicing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and in Rhodesia, and even if we get into South Africa, property rights and real estate is a fascinating topic of conversation. Well, yeah, like I said to everyone, he's had a couple of, and I'm going to put a link to these in the show notes, a couple of kind of threads on Rhodesia, kind of go off on Twitter, and it's always funny what catches and what doesn't. Some things you put a lot of thought into and it doesn't work, and some days you're just like driving to work and have an idea and it just goes. But for you, what kind of sparked your interest in Rhodesia? Did you have family from that part of the world, or what really sparked your interest in this?
No, this is an odd backstory. When I was in middle school-ish, I thought that, I still do, but I thought that Eric Prince and Blackwater were really cool. So I got into that, and through that found Soldier of Fortune magazine. Okay. And the founder, Robert Brown, wrote a book called Dancing with Devils, which was about starting it. And part of what he did was he's like smuggled arms to Rhodesia through like his local airport because he knew the guy who like checked for guns. So he talked about like going out hunting for rebels in the bush with mini 14s and banana mags he bought from home to like hand out to farmers because they thought it was cool.
That's wild.
And I was like, yeah. And I was like, well, I forget when the book came out, but I was like 10 or 12 or something. Sure. And I thought that was the coolest thing. It's just like some dude who thought it would be fun to go fight communists. And so I got into Rhodesia through that, and then kind of knew about it vaguely for a few years, and then found just somehow a copy of the memoirs of Ian Smith, the Rhodesian prime minister, and out of curiosity read it. This was back before it was like $400 a copy because interest has spiked. So I read it and thought it was quite interesting and started digging into a lot of what he said in there about the Western powers helping the communists, and started thinking it provided a lot of good lessons, and digging into it more just from reading other memoirs, other articles, and that sort of thing.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it was funny because I just started seeing stuff about it, and you're fascinated by it. They've got some great aesthetics going on with their, short shorts. I think I actually first started hearing about Rhodesia on like gun tuber channels, like YouTube
Yeah,
channels, and they're all like way into Rhodesia. And I was
yeah.
like, it's wild. But apparently this is associated with like this, even talking about Rhodesia is like a right wing talking point, or, the New York Times associates it even back in 2018 with white supremacy. So why do you think they're trying to spin that? Why are people on the left trying to spin it as like talking about this unique time that's fairly recent in modern history? Why did they spin it that way? What's their understanding of it?
So I think there's a few things going on there. The first is that they just lie, and they wanted to support the communists, so they lie about it to make it look bad. The second is they do have a point in that some of the bad guys, like Dylan Roof, for example, get into Rhodesia,
Oh, okay.
and they kind of take the wrong lessons from it. Like Rhodesia, for example, would kick out guys who it thought were too racist and were just there for a race war,
Yeah.
and weren't there to fight communists. So the white supremacist, excuse me, fascination with it is, I think, incorrect and misses the point. Whereas much more fight against communism than a race war. And finally, I think the big thing behind the media's hatred of it is that it wasn't a mass democracy. It was a landed voting republic, or property voting, but landed voting rolls off the tongue a little better. And so it was quite different from what we have in a way that they very much dislike. And so they try and smear it, with just the usual accusations to make it look bad, and people are afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they do this with everything, so it's not surprising. That's really helpful context. I had no idea about some of the connections there, so I appreciate you explaining that to me. So, we're finally getting to the point we got to ask the question for those who don't know, who haven't been kind of like nerding out on Wikipedia or whatever and finding these books that are $400. For the listener, what is Rhodesia, Will?
Yeah, so it's the country that's north of South Africa and below the Belgian Congo. It originally included what is now Zambia, I believe, and it was all Rhodesia, and then that broke off, and what was the British called Southern Rhodesia, which is essentially in between Mozambique and I think Angola. But it's in the middle of Africa, Southern Africa, below the Congo and above South Africa, and it was founded by Cecil Rhodes. And for fiction lovers out there, if you ever read the Alan Quatermain books, the hunter Courtney Sellis was a real guy, and that's who Quatermain was based off of. And he hunted in Rhodesia and helped kind of settle it. So it was settled by the British South Africa Company, headed by Cecil Rhodes, in the late 1800s, and kind of grew into an industrial and agrarian powerhouse by about 1920, when it became independent. Kind of independent. That ties into what happened later. But so it had its own legislature and started governing itself more or less, between 1920 and 1965, which is when things got spicy.
Yeah,
But so it was just a prosperous African country.
that's great. And it was a British colony before 1920?
Kind of. It wasn't a direct colony in the way that some were. It was a corporate property of the British South African Company,
Oh,
which
interesting.
kind of got a charter from Victoria after they settled it.
Huh.
Rhodes just thought it would be great to settle it, so he did it, and then kind of got permission afterward.
That's great.
Yeah, so it was never a direct colony; it was just a company for a while. So it was more like Jamestown than
Yeah, or like New
colonies
England.
you think of.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, to come to think of it, I don't know if have you ever read any books by Jack Carr? Do
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know
yeah.
that?
He brings it
That's
up too.
Yeah, he brings up Rhodesia and that. That's also like there were all these data points. I was like, everybody seems to be talking about it, so I want to know more about. Anyway, so it's kind of a prosperous country, Southern Africa. Does it have any direct governance from 1920 1965 with South Africa? Is it like do they have diplomatic relations with other countries? Are they fully independent? What you kind of hinted at something there. What were they like?
Yeah, so it declared independence from the Commonwealth in 1965, which is when the Bush War began. Before then, it was no longer corporate property. It was its own kind of independent Commonwealth state, more or less. I don't really know quite how to describe that because of its kind of odd ties inside the Commonwealth. Yeah, they weren't, though it was called British South Africa for a while, it wasn't directly connected with actual South Africa, which is much more Boer Dutch state than an Anglo state, whereas Rhodesia was much more just the whites there were Anglos almost entirely, not Boers. So it was a kind of different population. And they were known as more British than the British, particularly Ian Smith's generation. So the generation that was 20 or so during World War II, because they really inherited the British traditions and did their best to preserve them. in a different climate. So it was a very interesting small mini Britain, just in the African veldt.
Yeah, was there like I'm assuming there was a capital of Rhodesia. What's like the biggest city that was the capital?
Salisbury.
And it's still around today.
I think it's called Harare now. It's kind of
Ah,
like India where they renamed it.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so in 1965, that kind of gets us caught up. You've got what is known as the Bush War. Something's going on. What were some precipitating events that kicked this thing off?
So to understand that, you have to go to the Belgian Congo, which most of the atrocities attributed to the Belgians were either made up or conducted by the tribes before the Belgians got there. Regardless, the Belgians left in the early 1960s, and what followed was chaos. There was the Simba Rebellion, and then the fight over Katanga, which is the resource-rich part. And what happened there was pretty much all the whites were just murdered by various warring tribes, particularly the Nuns were raped, and it was horrific. And some Congolese whites fled to Rhodesia, where the Rhodesians decided that they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to be murdered. So they
naturally,
yeah, they decided that wouldn't be great. So they started negotiating with the British over what to do. And originally they'd been promised independence for fighting for the British in World War II. The British, under the socialists, particularly Attlee, reneged on that and didn't want to let them do it anymore. But after the Congo, the Rhodesians, under by that point Ian Smith, who was World War II pilot, was the prime minister of Rhodesia, and they signed their unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI, instead of acceding to majority rule, and became independent of Britain, though that wasn't recognized by countries other than like Portugal, Israel, and South Africa. Huh. It was a tense situation, and that's kind of when the fight against the communist rebels started, because they had conquered the Congo and were moving south towards Rhodesia. The communist influence was, and so the war began.
Okay, so this guy Ian Smith, I mean, he's a kind of a big name in the whole narrative and in the history. Was when he was in World War II, you said he was a pilot. Was he fighting for the British Empire? Was he fighting for Rhodesia? Like, what was his nationality then?
Yeah, so he was a Rhodesian. They volunteered to fight for the Commonwealth, particularly as pilots. In World War One, they served as infantry, and in World War II, they did as well, but they were better known as pilots. And Ian Smith was a Spitfire pilot who served for the British as Rhodesian, as a member of like one of the Commonwealth units in the Mediterranean. And it was a cool story. He was shot down over, I believe, Greece, and instead of surrendering to the Germans, he remained on the run until he reached safety. Just hiding out in peasant villages, and it's quite a cool story. In his memoir, but
that's awesome.
Yeah, so he's fighting for the British.
Okay, and so he gets elected, and part of the thing that you were talking about, it's more British than the British, has to do with probably how he got elected, because the only people that can vote in Rhodesia for any kind of office, I'm assuming they have a parliamentary government, would be landowners. Is that right?
Kind of. I call it landed voting just because that's easier and people kind of know what that is. Really, other forms of property counted as well, but it had to be based in Rhodesia, I believe. So you had to have a certain amount of wealth, and it didn't really matter whether you're black or white. And if you did, you could vote in the main election. I believe that was like ticket A. And then it wasn't a pretend election, but they had like a smaller, not really election that mattered for people who didn't fit the ticket A criteria.
Okay. So he gets elected before 1965 then? Had he been prime minister for a while?
It wasn't very long. I forget the exact year. It was shortly before the UDI, and he was part of a new party called the Rhodesian Front, which was more focused than in the past because of the situation in that time's present of fighting communism and becoming independent. So it was more of a narrowly focused party as opposed to the traditional like conservative liberal divide on Rhodesia's traditions and independence.
Okay, so I think that gives us enough background to move into the Bush War itself. So you've got Rhodesia files the UDI. They only receive diplomatic kind of status with a few other countries. And were there already communists in Rhodesia that were trying to undermine things and start the commie revolution there? Or how did that kick off?
Kind of. So Mugabe and Nkomo were the two leaders of the different rebel groups that were communist rebels fighting the Rhodesian government. They were more based outside in the countries surrounding Rhodesia than they were inside it, and they'd infiltrate it to attack. And they claimed to represent the Black Rhodesian people, which wasn't really accurate. Um, it wasn't an accurate view of the situation. That's what they claimed. And so that started around 1965. It had been happening a little bit beforehand, and it didn't really ramp up until the 70s, is when it became less of a police action, small-scale counterinsurgency, and much more of full-scale war, with more military operations than police fights.
Okay, so it starts in 65, but you're saying it goes into the 70s, and that's when it kind of like blows up and it's a full-scale like war. Is it like a civil war? Would that be the best category to think of it as?
Somewhat. It wouldn't be like the American Civil War or English Civil War, and that there are two internal sides fighting over territory. It was much more like the Vietnamese, or the action between us and the South Vietnamese against the North Vietnamese, and that
Okay.
there were external infiltrators attacking, say, like the NVA and VC would attack South Vietnam. It was much more that sort of situation where there were some based inside and some based outside, and it was fights between rebels and infiltrators rather than World War II style fights between territory.
Okay, so you've got kind of this, and in one of your threads you talk about this. There seems to be kind of an alignment with Russians and communists. I think America was involved in helping take down Rhodesia. Can you tell me some more about that? Like, why would they do it, and how did they do it?
Yeah, so with the exception of Israel, Salazar's Portugal, which fell in the Carnation Revolution in the late 70s, and then South Africa for parts of the war, it also kind of betrayed them. The whole world agreed with the UN and passed the first ever sanctions policy under the UN on Rhodesia. And so from that point on, it was sanctioned and embargoed by the whole world. And the West was leading the charge on that because the Soviets and Red Chinese were backing Mugabe and Nkomo. I forget which was which, but there was some fighting between them as well. Anyway, Harold Wilson was the UK's socialist prime minister at the time, and he refused to agree with the Rhodesians on independence unless they accepted majority rule, which they refused to do, for, as I mentioned before. And so he led the charge, and the pretty much remainder of the United Kingdom's navy was sent to patrol Mozambique and prevent the Rhodesians from importing oil. It failed. They didn't do a good job with it, but that's what they tried to do, and that was really the last days of the United Kingdom's navy, which was sad. And then the Americans, particularly under Jimmy Carter, when he was president, he was close with Andy Young, who was an American civil rights protester type. And Young was one of the ones leading the charge against Rhodesia, and supporting Mugabe, including after Mugabe became the leader. And so you had this confluence of socialists in Britain hating Rhodesia because of its landed voting and traditional hierarchy. The Duke of Montrose, for example, became part of Ian Smith's government because he thought it was more British than socialist UK, and ran a great estate there and was part of the government like his ancestors would have been in Britain.
Sure.
So there was that fight, and then the Americans hated Rhodesia because of the civil rights movement, and it had some communist leanings, and so there was that kind of spat over whether the old order should survive because it succeeded, or whether the new order should be put in, even though it was obviously failing everywhere else.
I mean, it's fascinating because it's not, I mean, as far as I know, it's not like a massive country. I mean, they seem to be independent, self-governing, want to be more traditionalist and hierarchical, aren't really doing the whole like democracy for all kind of like psyop. And so why, like, Mugabe, I mean, like, I'm pretty sure he's a very bad guy, you know, like he's a butcher. So it doesn't compute in my mind. And this is part of the revisionism that a lot of us have to undergo as Americans. Like, how in the world could they have picked this target, and why in the middle of Africa, you know, these people that just want to be left alone, are all of a sudden getting the pressure of the world put down on them? Like, how do you explain that?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, that's what made it so interesting to me, is that they were Britain circa 1850, just transplanted into Africa and with industrial machinery. It was very much the old world West that succeeded greatly in the modern day, which is one of the things I find interesting and quite like about it. It wasn't an authoritarian country. It wasn't some crazy place like North Korea. It was just a functional republic that really stuck by its smaller Republican roots in terms of the property voting system. And from what I can tell, they just hated it for that. They thought the only acceptable system is either communism, which is wild, or mass democracy. Everyone, no matter how incompetent, has an equal vote. All 7-Eleven robbery suspects can be astronauts. Like that whole just insanity. And they didn't really like, they assumed it had a racial angle because of what they heard about it, even though it didn't, which is also the sad part about it, because it was, I mean, South Africa was terrible on that, with apartheid inflicting kind of those tedious minor indignities upon people constantly. And then the Congo was a hellhole, Mozambique and Angola, after they thought of the communists were hellholes. So it was the one place where people of both ethnicities could kind of function and get along, and they just killed it because it didn't have mass democracy. Which, it's that like feminine focus on the means rather than the ends, no matter what the ends end up being because of the means, which I just find insane. But that they were willing to enforce at the point of a sword.
It's insane. Okay, so let's get into the Bush War a little bit when it kind of got more widespread. Did Rhodesia have a standing army at that point that they could defend themselves with? What did their standing army look like?
Yeah, so it was relatively small because there are a few 100,000 whites and a few million blacks. And even though it is over a pretty wide territory, it was thinly populated because it was relatively new as a colony and people hadn't really lived there before the British got there, at least in large numbers. So they had a small military, but an effective one. Alan Savory, who's kind of the father of the regenerative ranching movement, founded the Sella Scouts, which were their special forces type unit that could infiltrate and attack in small numbers. They're pretty similar to our Green Berets in some respects. They also had the Rhodesian Light Infantry, which was known for its fire force missions, where they'd parachute into enemy territory a couple times a day, because they didn't really have many helicopters due to the sanctions, but they did have some transport aircraft, so they just used and abused those constantly. And then there's the Rhodesian SAS, which is a lot like the British SAS. And then, interestingly, there were the Rhodesian African Rifles, which was white officers but black soldiers, and they were quite effective, and a lot of Africans volunteered to fight in them, kind of disabusing. It should have disabused the West of the notion that it was a racial war instead of a war between freedom and communism.
Right, yeah. So with these fire force missions, they would just get up in planes, find enemy encampments, parachute in, and kind of do, offensive campaigns against, encampments. Is that what was going on?
Right. Like, for example, they'd wait till either the communists were infiltrating and attacking, or they discovered a communist base either inside or outside the country, and then they'd fly in low, typically around, I think, 500 feet, if I remember right. So it's quite a low drop, and surprise them by just jumping on them with parachutes and fighting. They'd be picked up pretty quickly afterward because they won pretty much all their engagements quite easily, and then be ferried away, taken to the base, get a new parachute, and do it again, sometimes like 5-6 times a day. So that had to be hard on the knees.
Dude, for real. And so did they have, I guess, in terms of their armament, are we talking they made their own weapons? They already had weapons they inherited? Did they have tanks, anything like that on the ground?
Yeah, it was a mix of things. They had some tanks and armored cars. They also had some jets and bombers. Really, though, they were fighting as light infantry against light infantry. And I believe they had some domestic weapons manufacturing, but mainly, particularly as the war got going and equipment started getting used up, they imported the FAN FALs, for which they're famous, from the South Africans.
Right. Yes.
And you can tell those because there's a cutout circle in the receiver where the South Africans would just cut out the armory stamp so they could say, oh, they're not getting them from us. There's no armory, which was stupid, but they did it. And so they mainly used like FALs, FN mags, and then some submachine guns, but it was mainly riflery because of the pretty dense jungle.
Okay, yeah, that's another connection. The FAL is always talked about, like, I don't know what they call it, the armament of the free world or something like that.
The right arm of the free world.
The right arm of the free world. Yeah, I got to shoot one time. It was a good time.
Awesome.
So they're doing mainly light infantry and light infantry. Talk to me about their opponents. Are these mainly outside people? How many actual Rhodesian kind of natives, populace, are joining in these Marxists that are fighting the Rhodesian government and kind of the Ian Smith and the Sella Scouts and all that?
Yeah, it's hard to tell because there was so much particularly after the Portuguese Mozambique fell. There was so much travel between the communists in Mozambique and then the communists that were attacking Rhodesia, particularly with the chaos and the Congo. It was just a chaotic situation. So it's hard to tell how many were outside infiltrators that were just there for the paycheck and drugs they were given, and how many were actual African Rhodesians that wanted to fight the Rhodesian government. And also, I mean, it's like a guerrilla war in Africa, so kind of like the constant ongoing conflict in Angola or the still running conflict in the Congo. There's a lot of filtering in and out as people want to be there, get bored, and leave. And since it's such a chaotic situation and kind of crazy terrain, there's a lot of desertion.
Yeah.
So it's hard to tell.
So were these Marxist forces, were they getting arms from China, Russia, America? Where were they getting arms from?
Yeah, it was mainly Russia and China, so just Eastern Bloc weaponry. I haven't verified this, but I have heard from a number of Rhodesians that were there that the rebels received a large amount of weaponry from the United States that it had captured in Vietnam, or that had been used in Vietnam. I haven't confirmed that, but after my thread kind of took off, a number of Rhodesians who had fought in the war DM'd me and told me that. But it was mainly Russia and China.
Wow. This is why it's so fascinating. You've got a modern, well, it's modern in the sense that like it's in our time, like this was like 10 years before I was born.
Yeah.
And yet it's not modern in the sense that it's like a traditionalist, like you said, it would be like if you dropped any kind of 1850 kind of understanding of how politics and societies are structured hierarchically, and you drop that into today, and these people are surrounded, they've got the world against them, and they're trying to stand up for their rights against these crazy people. The other thing about it is it maps onto a lot of the other historical things that are going on in the 20th century. So when you look at pictures of Iraq, Afghanistan, these places that are at this point kind of a dumpster fire, you look at pictures back then, like they were beautiful, like they had like good culture, and like what happened? And so it feels like that happened in Rhodesia as well. Would you say that's fair?
That's very fair. Like if you look at pictures of Salisbury back when Rhodesia was still functioning, it wasn't Zimbabwe. The cars are different and people are dressed better. But other than that, it looks like America. It's like nice buildings, plate glass, not like communist thugs in the street shooting people. It's a crazy difference. And this is somewhat off topic, but I don't know if you've read An Open Letter by Curtis Yarvin.
I think I have at one point, but it's been a while.
At one point, he talks about how it's a British traveler's like diary or something from traveling to, it's like Bolivia it's Honduras, I think. And they say, like Honduras is so beautiful. It's like clean here and everyone's friendly and there's no trash in the streets. It's so nice. He's like, yeah, like back then they were calling Honduras clean. It's just a different world because it was like ruled differently. Instead of by just mass democracy, idiocracy, it was aristocrats determining what was best, and then under the kind of oblige mindset trying to make life better.
Yeah, and then even back then the aristocrats themselves were not corrupt commies. They were like, they were, they might not have all been Christians or anything like that, but they were like, they had a sense of duty and tradition and responsibility to use their power with wisdom and for the good of themselves and for their people. So it's wildly. I went to Honduras back in, it was 2006, down to Tegucigalpa. It was like a mission trip. We're going down there to work in an orphanage, and wild. Like the night after we left at the orphanage, there was a shooting. It's like not a great place at all. And so Rhodesia is like, and there's examples of this all over Africa, South Africa included, but like Namibia and all these places, where at this point the infrastructure is crumbling, the traditional culture and industry and all that stuff is just decayed, and it's just really sad. So with going back to kind of Rhodesia and the situation, how effective were the Cella Scouts and these Fire Force teams that went out and took these actions to defend themselves and do offensive campaigns?
Just on the decay point, because I find this interesting, there were more roads, like miles of roads in the Congo when the Belgians left than there are now.
Wow.
It's just like decayed beyond belief. But so to answer the question, it was a lot like Vietnam, where they were incredibly successful in killing the communists, but relatively unsuccessful in actually pacifying the area and winning notable strategic victories. There are a lot of big examples of this. One of the best is Operation Dingo, where I believe it was the RLA Fire Force, but I could be wrong on that. Could have been this like Cella Scouts and SAS. Regardless, they parachuted into this rebel camp they found and at the cost of 2 dead, one of whom was from friendly fire, they killed like a few thousand rebels and
Oh my
forced a few thousand
gosh.
more to retreat. It was like
Jeez.
an insane fight.
Yeah.
But at the cost of kind of expanding the war and getting the world mad at them, because I think it happened in Mozambique,
Ah.
or maybe Zambia. It was some other country that was nearby, and it wasn't Ian Smith's memoirs. It's another book about the war. Can't remember which one now. Where they talk about the problem with that was that it really expanded the war and got the world even more mad at them. So then, at the cost of killing 3,000 easily replaceable communists, or how many thousand, they heaped a lot of problems upon themselves, and the South Africans stopped supporting them.
Yeah.
So
Oh.
kind of like the U.S. and the Tet Offensive, where we killed a bunch of communists, but then the communists in our media were saying we lost because over there they were able to put up more of a fight. The Rhodesians, at the cost of killing a lot of communists constantly, just ground themselves down and expanded the war too much and ended up losing.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because as far as the geography goes, geography would play a huge factor in any war, but particularly
Yeah.
you're in, it's not technically, is it sub-Saharan Africa? It's Africa, but it's kind of
Yeah.
like bush country.
Yes.
And, you're trying to maintain your national sovereignty and your borders, and yet, you've got insurgencies happening, Marxist kind of insurgencies all over the place. You're surrounded. So was that part of the challenge they faced, and they had a hard time really
Yeah.
maintaining a footprint there? Is that what you would say?
Yeah. Like there were a few big problems with that. One was, if you can imagine trying to like defend somewhere like Texas with 200,000 total people from which you can draw an armed force, it's just really going to be difficult,
Yeah.
particularly because they weren't able to import anything. So they had a couple helicopters they could use and a couple jets, and then had a very difficult time importing oil. So they were like, the Gray Scouts were a horse based unit, and there are a bunch of crazy pictures of these guys in Rhodesian camouflage riding horses, shooting FALs, which it's like watching cowboys with semi-automatic guns, which is
Yeah.
cool. But like, if you're trying to defend a border with 50 guys on horses,
Right.
or I don't, the Gray Scouts was bigger than that, but still, like, it was very difficult, and they had trouble actually defending the border rather than catching rebels after they attacked farmsteads, which became a big problem.
Yeah. What happened when the rebels did capture land and got farmsteads? What would they do?
Yeah, so there's a few funny stories from these, because the Rhodesian farmers were pretty well equipped in terms of trying to fight them off, and they had bunkers to retreat to. So there's just one funny story of the rebels had received a mortar from the Soviets that they didn't really know how to use, and they were drinking anyway. So the family retreated to the bunker, and the rebels kept trying to mortar them, but the base plate was in the mud. So it kept sinking, and the mortar kept pointing more and more up. And then eventually they heard this huge boom. And when they went to investigate later, the mortar had gone straight up because it kept sinking in the mud, and the rebels didn't understand how physics worked, so it just blew them up.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they'd mainly infiltrate and try and attack farms like that, sometimes with more success, often without. They'd terrorize the black labor, because a lot of the farm laborers were native Africans who just needed the money. And so they'd terrorize them, torture them, and kill them. And that started to weaken black support for the Rhodesians, not so much because of any ideological conformity with communism, but much more just because they're scared of the rebels. The rebels would also leave out landmines on roads. So the Rhodesians had a difficult time traveling or getting from A to B, because not only do they have to worry about being ambushed, but at any point, a civilian road, because a lot of roads there are dirt, would just blow up, and they die. So they they did a really good job in being inventive and coming up with the V-shaped hulls for armored vehicles that we ended up using in Iraq and Afghanistan, but at the cost of a lot of civilians. And it was just, it really hurt their economy, because they were a cash crop based economy, and they couldn't export crops or move them because of the rebels.
Yeah. So they're kind of stuck in this position where they can't maintain the land they've got, but the land they've got is integral to their economic success and viability to fight the war. So was there ever kind of a thought given to retreating and making the borders smaller and maintaining a defensible position that 200,000 maybe could manage, and doing that kind of thing, or no?
Nothing I've seen.
Okay.
I think that wasn't really a consideration. And part of it was that they weren't really ever pressed along the whole border continuously. It wasn't like one of those situations on the Eastern Front where there are 100 divisions against
Totally.
200 divisions, which
Yeah.
is just metal. But it was more a group of 50 rebels would come across somewhere and cause chaos 50 miles into the border, whatever. So
Yeah.
I think they more tried to just protect their whole economic territory because they needed it, rather than retreating to a place there wouldn't be much of a point if they didn't, if they couldn't farm or couldn't have their
Yeah,
factories.
totally.
It'd just be a disaster.
Yeah. Okay. Quick tangent. Is there and if I'm wrong, I might just cut this from the episode, but I think there was a helicopter pilot from Rhodesia that after Rhodesia fell, he became like a mercenary all over Africa. Have you heard about this guy?
Yeah, I think his name's Neil Ellis.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe it's Neil Ellis. He was South African,
Okay.
I think. And so, do you know about executive outcomes? This could be a little bit of a tangent.
I've
But
heard about this. Tell me about it, though.
okay, so executive outcomes was the kind of progenitor of the modern private military contractors, where after South Africa got rid of apartheid and Mandela purged the military of most of its effective fighters, Eben Barlow, who was a super spy, special forces fighter, he was a cool guy. He founded Executive Outcomes to go fight conflicts in Africa where the governments just couldn't deal with the rebels. One of which was Angola, another was Sierra Leone, which Blood Diamonds touches on and unfairly treats Executive Outcomes, but regardless, they're in it. Neil Ellis was a pilot of, he focused on Russian helicopters who fought in those wars. And then when, I forget if he fought in Angola. I know he fought in Sierra Leone. And then after Executive Outcomes was forced to leave, kind of like in Rhodesia where the world thought they were means, they had to go. Ellis stuck around with his plane and was getting grants from the British government because they didn't really know what was going on. And he just said, he's like, oh, I'm cooperating with the Africans. So they kept funding him and giving him missiles and stuff. And he would single-handedly beat back the rebel armies as they tried to conquer, I think it's Freetown.
Yeah.
Or whatever name. And so there'd be like rebels coming and he would just fly in and start shooting at them and cause chaos and they'd retreat. And he did that like time and time and time again. And I think he ended up fighting for us in the Gulf War. I know he fought
really
during that kind of chaos.
Oh, man. Yeah, these are the kind of stories that if we wanted to have a great culture in America, like highlight that guy or highlight Ian Smith. Like these are fascinating figures that we never get to hear about. With Executive Outcomes, there's like a YouTube channel I watched called Administrative Results.
Yes.
And he's a fun guy. He's actually well, I won't get into that. I don't want to tell too much. One of my podcast guests knows him from family ties. But was Executive Outcomes like good? I mean, like I've heard, a lot of slander about it. Like, it was kind of, you're saying it's the precursor to like something like Blackwater or something like that?
Yeah, they, as always, they got a bad rap because it was white guys defeating African militaries in Africa.
Not a great look, yeah.
Yeah, but all they did was restore order. So like in Angola, there was a long-running fight between people who said they were communists and people who said they weren't communists. But it was more just like rival gangs butchering civilians and trying to steal diamonds. And so Executive Outcomes got a contract from Simon Mann, who ended up being involved in another situation later, and then another British guy whose name I forget, to defend this like oil refinery in Angola. And they thought it was going to be police work where they could wear like polos and maybe have a rifle. But it was like armored combat where they were offloading tanks with the Angolese military in a river, like while mortars were splashing around them. But they succeeded because they were competent instead of these drug addicted rebels who were attacking them.
Sure. And
so they ended that pretty quickly. And Sierra Leone had a similar situation where the Sierra Leonese civilians loved them because they bring food and medicine when they were starving and, had been chopped apart by the rebels.
Yeah.
And they beat back the rebels and kind of ended the conflict. And then after that, they were forced out by the UN. And then chaos returned inevitably, particularly in Sierra Leone.
Okay, so that's for the listener, that was a bit of a detour. Let's get back to Rhodesia. Yeah. Why did Rhodesia fall? How did it fall? What is it, a slow, just like eventually they gave up? Was there a final battle? Did they kill Ian Smith and everyone was demoralized? Tell me about the fall of Rhodesia.
No, Ian Smith survived until the 2000s. The Mugabe ended up expropriating his farm, which was sad, but he survived. It was more of a steady decline kind of towards the end. The South Africans betrayed them and stopped helping them because they thought it would take pressure off them because of the apartheid situation. And Mozambique fell when the Carnation Revolution happened. So the rebels took over there, which made it a lot harder to keep fighting. And they couldn't import oil, which became a problem because one of the last big events in the war was the rebels managed to blow up their oil supply, which they weren't very smartly kept at one location, I guess, because they thought they could protect it. But then they didn't do that. So they lost all their oil.
Jeez.
And then at the point where they couldn't fly planes, couldn't use the armored vehicles, couldn't run a civilian economy at all without oil, and the South Africans weren't really helping them. They had to try and negotiate a way out, which, of course, it was just one vote, one time, as in the rest of decolonized Africa, and was a disaster. But yeah, so that's how they fell. It was the oil and just kind of general decline.
What year was that it became? I mean, at that point, did they get rid of the existing kind of government structure and replace it and rename the country?
Yeah, so they changed their voting system somewhat in 1969. Smith said it was to try and get Africans more involved. The world said it was a racist change. It was probably somewhere in between. Um, and that replaced some of their original property voting system. But not really. It was more just. I didn't think it was a big change reading his book, from what I could tell. Anyway, so then in 79, which is when they fell, they got rid of all that and just tried a mass democratic vote. And originally, it wasn't Mugabe who won, it was some like relative moderate. Mugabe then demanded a recount, and the Americans and British backed him on that, which really hurt because then he just cheated. Like his thugs would just go to villages and shoot
Sure.
people who didn't vote for him. So it was like chaos. It was kind of like if you imagine the situation with the Black Panthers during Obama's election, it's like that,
Yeah.
but like 10,000 times worse because it was like real fighting.
Yeah.
So then, of course, he won because no one didn't want to get their hands chopped off for voting someone else. So then he was elected, and it was just huge decline from there.
Wow. And so was there like a treaty document or a surrender document signed somewhere that Ian Smith and the Rhodesian government signed, and that's, kind of like a certain day, or what did that look like?
Yeah, I forget the day. It was sometime in 1979. It wasn't a surrender document. It was just a change of government that allowed voting and quieted down. I think there was a treaty around then that the Americans, British, Communist bloc, and rebels were involved with, but that wasn't as big a deal as the vote and the vote fraud, if
Gotcha.
that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And so after that, you basically have a brand new country with different rulership, different rules. And what it's called today, what is it called?
Zimbabwe.
Yes, Zimbabwe.
If you remember in Blood Diamond, she goes, "We call it Zimbabwe now." And he goes, "Oh, do we?"
Yeah, I remember that. Classic. Okay, so did you talk about these people that reached out to you? Do people still from that part of the world, from Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, do they still refer to themselves as Rhodesian?
It's a mix. There were a few changes. So originally Mugabe was just a tyrant, and there was the land expropriation where all the white farmers had their land stolen and they were either killed or forced out. But then during the Trump administration, he put pressure on them to give the land back to white farmers. And there was also they couldn't farm it, and they haven't been able to for decades. So they did give the land back to white farmers and bring them back in. And I think there's now been some softening of the feelings where those people are okay calling themselves Rhodesians. And if you like hiking, there's a great hiking boot company based out of there called Courtney, which features in Jack Carr's books.
Oh, cool.
And they call themselves a Zimbabwean company, even though they're Rhodesians.
Sure.
But a lot of the people who fled because of Mugabe, I think, are a lot more bitter about it for obvious reasons, and they still refer to themselves as Rhodesians.
And was there mass migration to one place? Did a lot of them relocate to one place, or is it like all over the place?
No, I think a good number originally fled to South Africa, but then it went down the tube like a decade and a half later, and a lot of them again left at that point. Tim Bax, who wrote a book called Three Sips of Gin, which it's a funny tale in the book about how I got that name, but he originally fled to South Africa, and then his farm kept getting robbed, and people kept breaking in his house or into his property, so he just left. I think he went back to Canada. A lot of people went to Australia. There's that whole Commonwealth of former British states where I think most of them ended up, but not in a predominant number anywhere. It was kind of just scattered.
Well, that's great. So I think for the listener, I mean, we've spent a long time talking about history, and I could probably talk. I mean, there's so many threads to pull in this, and some of these actual threads on Twitter have books that Will has recommended that I want to pick up and check out, just because I've always been interested, whether it's World War II, Civil War, going on back, the fall of the Roman Empire. All this stuff is fascinating to most guys, and so you can go pick those up. But I did want to get into it before I let you go. Like, what are some lessons? I mean, in some of your Twitter work and other places, you've kind of teased out how the stuff played out in South Africa, and what are some lessons you think that and it is, we don't want to moralize history as if it's just lessons to learn to apply, but at the same time, there's some real tangible things. I've seen Charles Haywood on his podcast go through an actual manual. I think it was either for the
the Rhodesian SAS combat manual.
Yeah, which is fascinating. So what kind of lessons do you think you know there are to take away from this conflict?
Yeah, I think it's one of those few situations where there actually are lessons, which is interesting. I think in a lot of things that like situation is too different, where it doesn't. There aren't a ton of lessons to draw. Like, what are you going to learn from the Crimean War? Maybe something about management, but not a ton. It's not, the situation isn't the same. I think this is like one of the few situations where the situation is very similar. And so you can see how liberal democracy and communism are the same thing in all but name. They united to destroy Rhodesia because it presented a challenge to their institutions. And America did that a lot during the Cold War. We supported land reform in Vietnam, which was just socialism by a different name. We supported it in Rhodesia. We screamed at the South Africans. A lot of what we did in Latin America was about devolving authority from the aristocrats to the people and mass democracy. And so, for one, you can see that and communism just end up leading to the same outcome because it's about the lumpenproll against the aristocrat, which doesn't need to be a conflict, but it ends up being one if it's turned into one by the system of government.
Yeah.
I think the other lesson just is that like mass democracy doesn't work, particularly in a land with different ethnicities. This is something that Lee Kuan Yew pointed out about Singapore, is that you can have democracy if it's like one people with the same culture. Although I would disagree with that because it didn't work out even in Athens when it was of like 120 IQ civilization and they destroyed themselves because of democracy. And it was a city state. It wasn't even like dealing with all of Texas. It was yeah. So anyway, but it doesn't work because it just turns into a tribal fight between different ethnicities, which is unproductive and leads to worse outcomes for everyone. So I think the lesson there is that America was originally intended to be a property voting republic for a reason. The founders abhorred mass democracy because it never works. It's just the choosing of Barabbas on an institutional level, and they didn't want that. So I think we need to remember that because there's a lot of talk about like, what does America need? Does we need Red Caesar? Or do we need Salazar and Franco? And it's like, no, we just like, we shouldn't let like crackheads vote. It's not really that complicated. It doesn't work. Like if you don't have a minimum of property in a free country, it's probably because you're incompetent or there's something else going on that means you're not going to vote for the nation's interest, but rather for the programs. And so you can learn that. I think that's a pretty obvious lesson that a lot of people are waking up to. I think the final lesson is from the South African perspective, and it's that you can't negotiate with the tiger while your head is in its jaws because it's just going to eat you next. Because the South Africans, they betrayed Rhodesia because they thought it would help relieve pressure on themselves, which one, it didn't. Two, it just put the communists closer to their borders, whereas they could have had a buffer zone. And three, it earned them no goodwill with people who hated them anyway. They just threw it away. And I think, or they threw away what advantages they might have had. I think Republicans particularly do that a lot. Not in the same way as Rhodesia and South Africa. The stakes aren't quite as high.
Yeah.
But, whatever time they have an advantage, they throw it away in the name of compromise and get absolutely nothing out of it. I think McConnell, for example, has done that. Not that modern current politics are overly relevant just because it's a shit show. But sorry, I didn't mean to curse. But
fine.
So you can't do that. It's not going to work. You're not going to get anything out of it. I think that's really one of the big lessons, and it's one that's missed because people forget the South African connection towards the end of it when they betrayed them.
Yeah, and with South Africa, it's interesting because Nelson Mandela is kind of hailed as this like great figure, especially in our American school books and for the American populace. But I'm not so keen to. I'm suspicious of that narrative. And would you say I'm rightfully suspicious of that narrative?
Yeah, people forget he was arrested for being a terrorist. He helped blow up, I think it was a white church.
Oh my gosh!
He was it could have been a different building. It might have just been on Church Street. I forget because that's one of those things that I confuse myself with. But
sure.
Anyway, he was convicted of helping blow up a building and killed a lot of people who were innocent civilians. He was the head of the ANC's military division, and one, the ANC was this communist movement that ended up taking over South Africa. And two, it's like military division was terrible. His wife, Winnie Mandela, was known for necklacing people, which, not to get too graphic, but that's when they stick them in a tire, cut their hands off so they can't get it off, and then light it on fire.
Good Lord.
Which, horrible way to die. And that's what his wife was up to, like, on her weekends.
Oh my gosh.
He's an awful person. He was on the U.S. terror watch list until 2013, I think, 2008, something like that.
What? Bro, that's insane.
Yeah,
and I do want to go back a little bit to the voting because it is a question of political arrangements and what political arrangements are most befitting for certain peoples at different times. This is part of my research in New England, is studying the Massachusetts Bay Colony and how they had voting rights in church, and that was correlated with voting rights in politics, and it was connected to land ownership. And then you get to Connecticut, which is where my focus is, and they expand the vote to non-church members, which is an interesting twist, an interesting development. They developed the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is one of the earliest constitutional documents that our documents are derived from in some sense. And so I did want to ask, and whether Ian Smith or these other figures that have come up in Rhodesia, we've talked about hierarchy, we've talked about politics. Was there any kind of church stuff, like where you hear about these communists in Spain, for example, they're murdering nuns and all this kind of stuff. Was this going on in Rhodesia? Was there a strong, vibrant church there? Was it under attack? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there are a few things there that are interesting. One is that since it was such a British culture, the Anglican Church, I believe, was pretty strong. Secondly, since it was Anglican, there wasn't really the convent situation. There wasn't the Congo where those were easy attacks by the communists. Third, this reminded me because you brought up the Puritans in the Northeast, is that there was some element of that Cavalier Roundhead struggle that carried over to the US between the Cavalier South and the Roundhead North, and was in England, obviously. But then if you look at what happened in Rhodesia, this isn't strictly religious, but the House of Lords, which, is still Anglican, they're the peers, they're relatively good guys for how wealthy they are. They tried to veto the blockade and embargoing of Rhodesia because they thought it was just a horror beyond comprehension and they didn't want to be part of it. But because of the 1911 Parliament bill, they couldn't veto it for long, and the British ended up doing it anyway. But that was very much because those are still the Cavaliers. They're of Norman heritage, particularly the big families like Manners, Grosvenor, Percy. They're all Norman. And so that's very much the Cavaliers that still exist were standing against modern progressivism, whereas the Puritan descendants of Cromwell, who are really associated with parliamentary democracy, were very much standing for destroying civilization, which, even though I'm a Presbyterian and King Charles said the presbytery is no place for a gentleman, I very much stand on the Cavalier side of things. So I think that's another interesting kind of fight and blends over into religion with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always tell people as a pastor, because I am interested in the stuff. I mean, I have this podcast where I talk about this stuff, but a lot of people, a lot of Christians in America, they're very kind of they're more libertarian, and they've kind of bought a lot of stuff about how politics works and what politics is, and they know they don't like the parties, but they don't know how else to think. And my role as a pastor isn't necessarily on a Sunday to explicate politics, but we derive what a lot of Western culture, the British Empire included, the Commonwealth, was derived out of a lot of religious convictions and attitudes and culture and that kind of thing. So I think it's an integral part of a healthy society to have a good religion. It just matters what religion it is. And if you're a Marxist, you hate God, you hate people, you're an anti-God religion. And that's why it leads to horrors beyond our wildest comprehension. And there's tons of stories all over the world of communists. And I think, kind of landing the plane on the episode would be, I think for a lot of people, whether we're in a cold civil war, some people talk about in America, or culture war, or whatever it is, thank God we're not in a hot war. We want to avoid, any kind of hot war like that, as much as we can. And yet we should think carefully about political arrangements and what kind of forces, once you see BLM and these other movements that are openly Marxist, burning down cities and that kind of thing, that's really what shook me. It was easy for me to kind of go along and do what most conservatives do, which is we'll just compromise. We want to work together when people would be upset or anything like that. And then all of a sudden you see them do that and you're like, oh no, I think they've duped me. And I think a lot of Americans feel that way. I got duped, they played off my empathy, they played off my sympathy, and they're willing to ask questions that maybe they weren't before, which is a gift. But we have a lot of things we need to get better at, and I think politics is one of those. Any concluding thoughts you want to offer to the listeners?
Yeah, I think one thing this reminded me of it when you're talking about religion is that it shows, Christianity has to mean more than just be nice, vaguely according to whatever the standards of the time are.
Right.
Which is what, that's what the finger-wagging leftists say Christianity means. But for one, that's obviously not what it meant to Richard the Lionheart and that crowd, is they weren't going along with that. And two, if that is what it means, that's just what the communists are using to destroy you.
Yeah.
So I think muscular Christianity is something people have to get used to supporting and being, as otherwise they're just going to face the same fate as the Rhodesians. Not that the Rhodesians weren't muscular, but
No, I know.
that idea that you have to like bend to the terrible times, people who hate you because of the commandment to be nice that isn't in the Bible. It's just,
fair.
it's a disaster.
Yeah, one of the best books. I've had so many guys read this book, Defenders of the West. I've had the
Yes.
author on my podcast for listeners. And he's jacked too. I don't know if you know this. He used to be a bodybuilder. He's like
Raymond Ibrahim, right?
Yeah, he's a cop.
That dude is a
Christian.
block. The picture in the back of the book is insane.
Yeah, it's insane, dude. But you look at our heritage, you look at our history, Catholic, Christian, whatever, and it's like, dude, these guys had no shame and standing up against enemies. And it was rooted in their religious convictions, which is damning on us as far as like how have we so misunderstood what our own religion is about that we too can't, stomach the scorn of the world. Like I'm pretty sure Jesus talked about that a lot. We should be able to be strong and confident. Christ is Lord, and we can celebrate that, and we should be unashamed of it. Of course, we should love our enemies. We should pray for them, particularly the imprecatory Psalms. But like we shouldn't be so insecure in our own traditions, heritage, culture, and religion. It's a shame. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that.
He wouldn't have said to sell your cloak and buy a sword if you don't have one already, if the point was just to be beheaded by communists anyway.
Right. No kidding. All right, well, this was a great conversation. Thanks for coming on and talking Rhodesia. Kind of give me some pointers and tips and books to read. I'll make sure to put a link to your threads and the American Tribune.news in the show notes. Anything else, anywhere else people should find you, follow up with your work?
That's it. Just shoot me a DM on Twitter if you're interested, and check me out on Substack.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening today to this conversation on Foolproof Theology. Had a great time talking about Rhodesia, all things Rhodesia. Feel free to leave a comment, YouTube, give it a great rating wherever podcasts are found. I'd love your support. I need your help. Sign up on the Patreon. Go over to the Patreon link in the show notes. Sign up today at $5 or $15 a month. You can get direct access to me to ask any questions. You also get some swag if you sign up today. So head over there, sign up, and we'll see you next time.